So today I'm bringing guys a brand new sports cards video. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down the most recent golden auctions and what it means for the hobby, some of the cards that people have taken incredibly bad losses on, and some of the cards that have actually performed better than expected. So an overall theme for this whole auction has been there has been a few hot sectors, I believe, of course, with the World Cup, going on during the auction. When the auction was live, we're seeing a lot of key Gold Cup or World Cup prisms do incredibly well. For example, Lionel Messi's one-of-one Nebula Choice from 2022 World Cup set has done $97,000. The one-of-one, of course. There's, of course, some autos in here that have done $19,200. I do find this a little bit odd, considering an auto black one-of-one in a PSA 6 did just $19,000, whereas a base Nebula did $97,000. Without the auto. So that is definitely something to take into account. A lot of the times you're going to assume that an auto one-of-one is going to be priced higher, when in fact a base card can at some points be worth more than the autograph version. So that's something to definitely keep in your mind. Now, another big thing is that wax has stayed a lot more steady than cards, and that has kind of been a theme for some time. I know wax has, of course, dropped a little bit more recently, but there are a lot of key sets that have done pretty well despite the market going down quite a lot. Now, the biggest cards in this auction had a real tough time. We see, of course, the LeBron and the Tom Brady, and these really took a beating. We're seeing the higher end market, the most high end market, kind of saturate a little bit, just because these cards have come up way too much. At one point, you'd see one come up every few months. Now we're seeing these cards constantly come up. LeBron's Upper Deck Exquisite, Giannis Golds have been coming up a good amount more than they used to. Just a lot of these bigger whale cards have really been selling more often. And the good sign about that is that they're going into the hands of people that are likely going to be holding them for longer. So someone who's buying this Tom Brady at $600K is less likely to sell it in the next, couple of months. As opposed to someone who's owned it for a while. So that is why I believe it's a good sign that, cards are exchanging hands and getting into more investors that are willing to hold it. Now, this BGS 8.5 was a $2.3 million card at its peak, and is currently down to $600K. So we're seeing some investors take multi-million-dollar losses on cards, which is absolutely insane. Of course, the person who bought this may not have been the same person who sold it right now, but the same card is down, a good amount, $1.7 million, which is, pretty much 75% of its value. So we're seeing a lot of these higher-end cards really lose value. I do think the higher end market is just, there's a handful of buyers and there's way too many cards coming up for the buyers to really continue to buy all of these cards that come onto auction. So another big thing is LeBron James is number 78. Of course, this Exquisite is one of his most iconic cards, if not his most iconic card, and it has been a chase for every single LeBron investor and collector in this hobby, and this card is currently down to around $570,000. This was also a multi-million-dollar card. We see it sold for $2.46 million in October of 2021, and it's down to $570K. So a lot of these investors are taking big losses. Whether this person had owned it for a long time is now just selling it off and still making a profit. It's still 25% of what they could have got at the peak. So it's definitely a lot of losses that are hurting a lot of investors. But at the end of the day, markets do go up and down, and I do think some of this is healthy, that cards are exchanging hands from people who are not willing to hold to maybe people who are willing to hold more. So we are still seeing a few players in particular that are still performing quite well, at least in this auction. One of them, of course, has been Joe Burrow. I know Joe Burrow is having an incredible year after he started this year very slow, and a lot of people were writing off Joe Burrow, but his his cards are up a good amount since the start of this season. So there was definitely a lot of Joe Burrow investors who are incredibly happy with how his prices are doing right now. Along with Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts at the beginning of this year, people were not willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars on his cards. And we're seeing some of Jalen Hurts' key cards sell for 5 to 6 figures, which is incredible to see. But there is a big loser of this NFL season, and that is going to be Justin Herbert. His cards were incredibly hot at the beginning of this year, and a lot of his cards have really cooled down since. So a lot of Justin Herbert investors are taking big losses currently. So that is definitely one thing that is hard to predict. Of course, the Bengals had a great season. The Chargers didn't have the best season, and they're probably not going to have a great, postseason. So I think a lot of that's reflected in the prices of quarterbacks right now and NFL players in general. But as we can see, as I was talking about, we see a lot of wax hold up. This was a $20,000 box last year. It's currently 15.6, which is not terrible if you look at what other sports cards have done, especially cards in this set have gone down as much as 75%, but the actual hobby box, just because it's so rare, has held up a lot better. So that is definitely, a better way to invest if you're not so risk tolerant, and you want to just put your money into a little bit of a safer spot where you're not betting on a player or betting on a specific card, but you're betting on the overall set. And so I did want to go over a little bit about this current vintage elite auction, which has 2 hours left as I'm recording this video. By the time this video is up, of course, it is over, and you guys can check the prices on this. But I did want to talk a little bit about the vintage versus modern debate, because that is an ever-going debate in the sports card hobby. What is better to invest in? What's going to get me the best returns? What is going to be the safest? And of course, a lot of those answers are pretty obvious. The safer is going to be vintage. The higher upside is going to be modern. But I will say, there can be great upside in vintage cards. And I think a lot of people kind of fail to see the big growth that vintage cards have had over the last few years, and how much potential they have if, institutional money comes into the sports card market. Bigger investors who are going to want to put their money into sports cards in the future are likely going to go after vintage, to be honest. And I think that's where a lot of the upside lies, is when big institutional money comes into the sports card market and they start buying up these vintage cards and fractionalizing them, or just holding on to them for the long term, because you see a lot more long-term investors in vintage cards. And so when the market is going down, you see less people selling off and prices not going down as much. However, when the market's up, you still see a great amount of people buying into vintage. So I think there's a high upside, but a lot lower risk, as opposed to modern. That is my take at the moment. I still stand by it. I think there's going to be a lot of upside in the vintage market when sports cards, when the market continues to come back and more investors continue to hop in and put long-term money in the sports card market. So I think a lot of this higher end vintage is going to go up, as well as low grade vintage, because I think there's always going to be a good market for low-grade vintage cards that are a little bit more affordable, such as low-grade Michael Jordan Fleers, whether you want a Babe Ruth Gaudy in a low grade, or just, not even talking about the top of the top, but just any solid player like Allen Iverson, or some player who has relevance in the long term, especially when I look for vintage more than the actual career the player had as well. I look at that, but I look more about their significance in culture. And I think guys like Julius Erving, Allen Iverson are always, Kobe, of course, Jordan, of course, but I'm saying, like, guys like this, Julius Erving, Allen Iverson, who still have so much impact on culture and the growth of basketball. I think that's going to be huge for the long-term prices of their cards. So that's the personal players that I'm wanting to invest in, more culturally impactful players, as opposed to just great baseball players or great basketball players. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. But a lot of these prices are honestly pretty steady. I wouldn't say there are any huge surprises in terms of the vintage auction. Of course, there's still time left, so of course prices are going to end higher than they're at right now. A lot of times in the last 2 hours, prices really go up. So I definitely don't see any huge drops in terms of, vintage basketball or vintage football or vintage baseball. But yeah, I really hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you enjoyed, go ahead, drop a like, subscribe. And other than that, I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and I'm out. Peace.